pretty packed agenda tonight, so we're going to try and stay on course. The first thing we're going to talk about is the Seattle 2035, which is reviewing Seattle's comp plan. And so we have Patrice Carroll with DPD with us, and so I'll turn it over to Patrice. She's going to make a short presentation, and then we'll allow some time for some questions.
Yeah, and just a little hands. I know that there's some people here who are very familiar with the comprehensive plan. How many people are not that familiar with the comprehensive plan? Okay, so this is really it's a long range. We're looking out 20 years of how the city will grow and change. And we have a document. Sometimes I bring it with me. I don't have it with me tonight. It's about yay big. It's about 700 pages long. It has over 2,500 policy statements in it. It covers a full range of topics. So again, there's a lot of focus on land use, of course. But it talks about housing. It talks about capital facilities. It talks about economic development. And this is a document that we use to come up with more specific policies and regulations. So it's not zoning. So it's not going to tell you what you can, in terms of land use, it's not the kind of document that tells you what you can build and can't build and how big buildings are on a specific parcel. It talks much more generally about the pattern of land use in the city. So, and this is part of really a regional effort to kind of grow in the right places, to have growth, to have people live and work in places that have transit, where there's some local services, shops and services, where it's more walkable perhaps than other places. And so again, by growing in those places, regionally, we can preserve farmland and the mountains and the beautiful natural resources that we all, live here in the Northwest to enjoy. So, about every 10 years, we take a hard look at this plan and see what we need to update. And the process starts at the state level, where they generate some projections for how much the state is going to grow over the next 20 years. And then that kind of devolves down to how much is each region going to grow. And then within our region, it also devolves down to King County. And what's going to happen in King County? What's going to be the pattern of growth in King County? So we have what's called the King County Growth Management Council that work together. They collaborate. It includes all of the elected officials of all the cities and towns within King County. And they come up with an estimate of how we can meet that, how we should meet those projections. And then Seattle, we figure out within the city boundaries of Seattle what might be the best pattern of growth for us in the next 20 years. So the kind of growth that we're looking at is, anybody want to take a guess how many people might be coming to our fair city over the next 20 years? A lot. Like 120,000, I think. So that's kind of one of the guideposts that we're planning for. And also a lot more jobs. We haven't seen a lot of job growth, particularly in the last 10 years. It's been really economically challenging, but the projections are putting Washington State and our region and our city kind of back on a pretty aggressive growth curve. So we're looking at 115,000 jobs. Now again, that sounds like a lot. Our region, which includes all of the surrounding counties, is much larger. So Seattle's share of that whole regional growth, because we're kind of constrained in terms of our land, is pretty steady. I think right now we're kind of around like 25% of the region's growth. So we don't see a big change in that. There's probably going to be a similar share, but the numbers are going to be bigger regionally. The numbers are going to be bigger in Seattle. So one of the things that we're doing right now is we're going to begin what we call an environmental impact assessment, and that's what these brochures that I handed out to everyone is about. And this is a process that, again, allows us to look at the broad pattern of growth within the city of Seattle and see what some of the implications are. are we going to need, is everybody copied with these? Yeah. Sorry. Are we gonna need more police stations? Are we gonna need more fire stations? Do we need more schools? Is our infrastructure sufficient to handle that amount of growth? And again, the pattern of growth, like where we grow, could have huge implications for how people move around the city, how people get to their jobs. Are they gonna have to drive? Can we connect it better with transit? So these are some of the things that the EIS will look at. So right now we have 3 conceptual alternatives that these pie charts kind of represent the growth that we might see. And our strategy here in Seattle to grow in places where it's smart to grow is what we call the urban village strategy. So we have 3 types of urban villages. The urban centers, which are the most dense. Those are places like downtown or the University District. We have something called hub urban villages, which are less dense than our urban centers, but more dense than other urban villages. And that's places like West Seattle Junction, Ballard. So again, they're a little bit bigger. They tend to have...
Which junction?
How do we relate what you're saying right now to the
colors?
To the alternatives 1, 2, and 3
Yeah.
that are listed here?
So the map shows the darkest green are the urban centers.
Oh, okay.
So those are the densest places, and then that middle green are the hub urban villages.
Okay.
And then the light green are what we call residential urban villages. And these are still walkable, kind of mixed-use communities. The difference between the residential urban villages and some of the other ones is that most of the services and the retail there is really geared to serve people in the immediate community. So there's not a lot of services for people coming from far away. But in a place like Ballard, that's a hub urban village, you see a lot of services there or jobs there that are serving a much larger area. So the pie charts here represent, we think the urban village strategies is a good strategy. We still think it is the right way to grow, is to grow where we have transit, where we have those neighborhood commercial districts. But there's a lot of variations, like how much growth should be in the urban centers versus maybe the hub urban villages. So that's what these 3 alternatives are. They're kind of a variation of that urban village strategy. So one is looking at maybe there'll be a little bit more growth in urban centers than we've seen in the past 20 years. And what are some reasons why that might happen? We know nationally that younger people are more drawn to more urban areas. They seem to be choosing that lifestyle a little bit more than previous generations. We see some big investments in our urban centers that we think could attract a higher level of growth than they experienced in the last 20 years. So those are the kinds of things that we think about. The option 2 is a little bit different. We're still having a lot of growth in urban centers, but not quite as much. So maybe here we see a little bit more growth in the hub urban villages and urban villages, because maybe there's an opportunity to have more jobs in those places. We hear people talk about that a lot. Maybe people want to live in smaller urban centers, in kind of they don't want to live in the denser urban centers. They'd rather live in the urban village, which is kind of more neighborhoody. So that's an alternative that we wanted to look at as well, to see what would that mean if maybe the jobs are a little bit more dispersed. The third one is what we call the transit focus, and this is about light rail transit. Really looking at light rail as an attractor for jobs and people, and looking at the areas around existing light rail stations and also some future light rail stations, the ones that Sound Transit has already kind of approved and intends to build within the next 20 years. So this alternative would actually, you see these pink areas, and those would be kind of maybe some new urban villages around some of those future light rail station areas. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Is that like kind of distinct? So again, we're gonna analyze, what we're proposing is to analyze these alternatives. We don't have a lot of information about them now, but we have a team of consultants that's gonna look at a whole range of topics. They'll look at what the implications are for transportation, around some environmental issues like noise. They'll also look at what this could mean in terms of our housing and population. Yeah, so I saw some hands.
Hi.
As we go along.
Sure. Okay. Along with being the chair of the Westwood Northville Arbor Heights Community Council, which actually this residential urban village that you have down here kind of on the south end, there's a transit hub there. I don't know if you guys know that, but Metro put a transit hub in. It's not a real transit hub. It should be, if they're going to keep dumping the buses down there. And it should be considered as something that is within this 2035 scope. You know, we don't have light rail here yet.
Right.
But by 2035 we should. So you guys really need to have that focus. And I just don't see a lot of focus on West Seattle. I'm also on the board for the West Seattle Transportation Coalition. And we are a group of people representing the peninsula on transportation issues. And that's going to be a big focus. So if you say your transit focus is Rainier Valley, Capitol Hill, University District, Roosevelt, and Northgate, you need to add West Seattle in there as well, period.
Yeah.
So whether you're doing an urban village focus or you're doing a transit focus, you guys need to put West Seattle into this literature because it's not there. And that to me means that it's not going to be there. And we can't be ignored again, which we have been, because we were told we were going to have monorail and we never got it. So we were not part of ST2. We were maybe didn't part of ST3. So I just want you guys to understand, from my perspective, being in the south end here, already having a hub, a transit hub, that these things are happening whether you're planning for them or not. I mean, they are already happening. So.
And you also need to remember that over 20% of the population of the city of Seattle lives on this side of the Duwamish River.
Right. We have 125,000 people just in the city limits. That doesn't include Burien and unincorporated King County, which also uses the 120 and all of the same transit that runs through to the city. So it doesn't end at that line. And it has to be something that the city of Seattle also has to think about in case unincorporated King County does get sucked up at some point between now and 2035.
Willard, did you have your hand up?
Well, you stole my thunder because
I'm sorry, brother.
I am just mortified, absolutely mortified that there's no attention paid to transit in West Seattle in this plan. That's the issue for us.
Yeah, it's not, this isn't, I want to clarify. This isn't the plan. This is information that will help inform the final plan. So the EIS, all the EIS does is look at these conceptual alternatives, and it gives us a lot of information so that we know how they're different.
But
So
it
that
is
we can-
actually,
so that we can compare and contrast them. And we will probably not pick one or two or three. What we will do is we will take the information that we learn from these alternatives and we'll create a preferred alternative. So what I'm hearing from you is that we need to include in this study
West
an
Seattle.
alternative 3, which would include some transit lines that are not yet adopted by Sound Transit but are being studied. So that would be like the line to West Seattle. That would also be, and we've heard this from other people, that would be the rail study between downtown and Ballard, and possibly a rail corridor between Ballard and the University District. So those are like kind of the next 3 that are being studied now, but again, have not been adopted. So that would be kind of an accurate. You'd like us to look to include that rail line that's being studied in West Seattle as part of our alternatives analysis.
I demand that you do that.
Yeah.
It's not an ask.
Right. So, and again, that would mean probably focusing And again, we're not doing it, this isn't a transit plan, but this is the land, this would be kind of the pattern of growth and development. So that would mean in alternative 3 that we would identify those areas, and we would assume that there would be more growth around those transit stations than we've seen in the past 20 years.
But it seems like that it would make sense if you look at the tremendous growth that's taking place on the peninsula right now. I mean, there's over 3,000 units of housing that are either under construction, under permit, or on the drawing board. And, it shows no signs whatsoever of slowing down. And not to include, West Seattle as part of the overall picture just doesn't make sense. Beyond the transportation issues that we already have, that nothing's on the horizon to address.
Yeah, and the other thing I do want to clarify is alternative 2, urban village focus. So there are 3 residential urban villages in West Seattle and 1 hub urban village in West Seattle. So again, those would be areas that, in that scenario, there would be, an assumption about what would be the implications of more growth in those villages.
Michael?
I think this plays into a worry that a lot of us, certainly out here, often have about the silos that exist between city departments. Because it'd be really easy to look at this map from just a land use perspective and talk about what sort of growth should West Seattle take land use wise. And we're going to maintain mostly single family housing in West Seattle. Or look at a transportation map and say, well, based on, people here, how much transportation do we have? But that misses some of the geographical realities we have in the city, or some of the infrastructure realities we currently have, where even if we determined that West Seattle was going to be slow growth for the next 20 years and not take very much of that 120,000 people at all, we're getting to the point where we have we right now have a maximum capacity on the bridge and our other connections to the rest of town. So even at a slow growth, we could be right at capacity for what we can do transportation-wise and infrastructure-wise.
Yeah.
And so that has to play a factor in it, and we're not the only corner of the city that's dealing with some of those unique issues. So we've got to make sure we're asking those sort of high-level questions when we look at the map.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I will tell you that DPD is not doing this on our own. And again, comprehensive plan, very broad. So we're working with SDOT, we're working with the Office of Housing, we're working with the Office of, we have what we call an interdepartmental team, and those subject experts are very involved in developing and helping us look at our existing policies and making proposals and recommendations about what changes we need. Also, on the EIS team, there's a lot of different disciplines, and Farron Piers is actually the transportation expert that's on the consultant team. So we are trying to integrate, and the comprehensive plan is a good place to do that. It's high level, but it does allow us to look at all those different areas and see if the pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Was your name Michael back there? Yeah, I think this will build on what you were saying. And a few minutes ago, ma'am, I can't remember your name. Okay. You were saying that if West Seattle does indeed want to really boost transit in our area and from our area, that maybe we should be also okay with there being a larger prediction of growth in the West Seattle area. And I want to point out that I think we're not starting from a level playing field. As Michael was saying, we have taken on a lot of growth already, huge growth, especially in terms of apartment projects and stuff. And the transit has not kept up with that. So we're starting from a situation where we really need to get transit to come up to where we already have been put in terms of growth of apartment buildings and commercial zones and stuff, before being asked to take on more growth in order to as a quid pro quo for getting some additional transit in our area.
Yeah, and that's what this study is about. Let's find out what are the implications if we assume that there is gonna be a lot more growth around in those urban villages, so again, this exercise is really to inform us so that we can better answer those questions, because right now I can't answer that question. But after we have the EIS, we'll be able to talk about that and see, like, in alternative 1, the traffic situation is way better than it is in alternative 3, or in terms of people using transit, we'll be able to kind of compare and contrast what those choices mean. And again, we have to look at it citywide, right? It's not just about West Seattle, it's not just about one urban village, it's how does it all work together? So that's what the EIS will help us do. It'll help us understand what the implications of those broad patterns of land use are.
I have a question, because we have been discussing the concept of growth and infrastructure, and we've seen a tremendous amount of growth come in without much contribution by the builders towards the infrastructure. Who's responsible for making that bridge? Because I feel grossly left out of that decision.
And it hasn't been the city's policy to, I think what you're talking about are impact fees. And so that hasn't been something that the city of Seattle has used in the past. It is something that the city's gonna look at.
When did they stop having impact fees, or did they never have them?
I'm not sure.
We've never had them. There are hookup charges to hook up to your water system. There are a couple small impact type fees. The city has impact fees that are known and allowed by the state government that can be used.
So when you call this an environmental impact study, that seems to be a key component to it, to me. Is it part of the study?
No, but there is a separate study that is looking at the feasibility and what that
And
would
who
be.
drives that, and do you guys talk to them?
I'm sorry?
Who drives that process?
I haven't really worked on that project at all. I don't know if David knows anything about it.
Do you have any understanding of how discerning that is for you to say you don't know who's going to finance that gap, and you're looking to plan it? I mean, that's a real disconnect, and I think the disconnect has existed for a while now.
Okay, the environmental impact statement is going to look at capital facilities, so there will be some indication of what capital facilities are needed. It's unlikely to have an implementation plan. Again, this is to give us information so that we can have a discussion about what the differences are, and again, this is to help us decide what pattern of growth works best for us in the future. So this is not the only work that's going to go on and feed into the comprehensive plan. And we know that the community is interested in the city studying how impact fees might be able to support infrastructure where growth is.
So
that is
how does
something
that
is
feedback
gonna be-
come from your group to somebody else? I mean, is there a mechanism? You're collecting comments, right?
Yes.
How does that get from you to somebody else that can do something about it?
Probably through what we call our interdepartmental team. There'll be a comment. I mean, we'll share summaries of comments with public, and then that will also be shared broadly amongst all the departments that are involved in working on the comprehensive plan. And where we get comments about projects that are more specific than the comprehensive plan, we can certainly forward those comments to those staff as well.
Okay, you have a question?
I do have a question. So, you brought up the existing transit centers that are not identified on here. And I see that along Delridge it says outside centers and villages, but I know that one of the first micro-housing projects went in on Delridge recently. And I'm wondering how that works with the idea that micro-housing is supposed to be in an area where people can walk to things. That the one that went in was just up the street from here, and there's no services anywhere nearby. You have to drive or take the bus to get groceries, or you can perhaps walk to a corner store. But that's about all there is available. So if we're talking about adding transit hubs, if you add that to this plan, does that mean that we then get more density? Does that change single-family housing areas to more density?
Well, again, we're not making any changes right now, we're just studying, so that's
But if
what
we're
this
adding the-
alternative.
Right, so
would
if we're-
study, and again, it would provide some information that would say, these are the implications for housing under alternative 3. It's not gonna tell you specifically exactly where because you don't know where new growth,
Right.
there's thousands of individual decisions that get made that result in where growth actually occurs.
Well, I think what I'm getting at is that while we need our transit needs addressed, I don't know that we necessarily want to become a potential new urban village location. I don't know that anybody here would like that to happen in their neighborhood.
I don't think that's Delridge.
Unless we're trying right down the middle.
I know we probably could have attacking you, and I apologize for that. My question,
Good discussion, very substantive.
what I'm finding to be difficult to hear is that there's like a compartmentalization of, it's either alternative 1, 2, or 3, right? Or shouldn't it be all of these things?
Hopefully, the preferred alternative
If you're
will
saying
have the-
like,
will
if
have the
there's
best
building,
in
then we'll
each
put
of those.
transit, as opposed to, we're gonna put transit and then we're gonna build. See what I'm saying? So first you build the transportation and the infrastructure, and then you put the people there, because if you try to do it in reverse, it's so costly and expensive, and it doesn't make any sense. You're more limited, you know, if you have a wide open street to begin with, and you can put light rail on it, and then you give the permits to build the big buildings next to it, as opposed to then narrowing the sidewalks and this sort of thing, with doing like a walking. So, I guess, you know, when you're talking about a residential urban village, Westwood Village is not a residential urban village. It carries Target, and those people come from Vashon, and they come from Burien, they come from everywhere. Those buses are coming from Georgetown, Beacon Hill, Bellevue. I mean, this is, you know, just as much of a urban village, which it is from the 1994 plan. It's now been downgraded to a residential village, so I'm just a little, I'm concerned about your terminology, and I'm concerned about what even this environmental impact statement, who are you working with in the neighborhoods on that? Like, who are you? Okay, you're getting feedback, but are you working with specific groups in our community to help develop a specific plan for this, or?
We've had a number of meetings, so we were just here last week, so.
So you're just doing like, you're not doing like, you know, reaching out to Transportation Coalition or the,
No, we are,
okay.
yeah. So we're trying to set up brown bag lunches with transportation choices and, yeah. So we are meeting with sort of more community organizations, as well as some of the groups that specialize on specific issues in housing and transportation and land use.
Okay.
So, yeah, so we're trying to cover as many bases as we can.
Sure.
And, but if you have suggestions of other groups,
Yeah.
no, I mean, we're like, we have a big team, and so we have been going out and doing presentations to.
Well, the first one would be the Land Use Committee that is forming. The second would be the West Seattle Transportation Coalition, two groups that are looking at land use and transportation in West Seattle, by West Seattle as people who live here and work here, sort of thing. So I can give you my contact information afterward, for sure.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? As you gauge this, there's been a series of comprehensive plans, I think, right? So this is an update.
The first one was done in 2004, and that was a pretty big deal. That was the first one that was created after the Growth Management Act, and that was the city's kind of plan based on the mandate of the Growth Management Act. It was updated once in 2004 to, again, incorporate some new projections, but there, I wouldn't say there was as extensive an outreach effort and at that point in time. So that's another reason why we're doing the EIS. There was an EIS done in 1994, but there wasn't one done in 2004 to kind of see what the implications were. So it really took the existing plan and just kind of, integrated the new estimates in it, but it didn't kind of look at making any shifts.
Is there a look back though from the 2004 concepts?
Is there
It's an assessment in terms of, back in 2004, they came up with these guidelines and these concepts, and was there any element of measurement in terms of whether they complied with what their expectations were, or some element of, were we successful?
Yeah, we do have on our website, this is, it's called a background report. So there is the two big metrics that the city sort of uses to judge the performance of the plan is really where new development happens and where new jobs happen. And so, based on the 2004, like in 1994, the plan predicted that there would be 59,600 households. And the actual numbers for not quite 20 years, but like 19 years, from 1995 to 2013 is 59,699. So it was
That's eerie.
99, and again, there's still another year's worth, and it's been a bumper year, certainly. But it was shockingly close in terms of the housing of what that 1994, and looking at the actuals over kind of a similar period. Jobs was a different story.
And did the density get aligned consistently with?
And it was also very close in terms of the overall, the plan was looking to guide about 75% of those new households to be in those urban centers and urban villages. And that is the breakout that we saw in the actuals as well. The place where it's not very good is in the individual villages. And there it's like, the geographies are so small in some places, we were not very good at estimating that at all. So that's a big problem for us, and we don't really know how to solve that.
Okay, so let's take one more question from Michael for this segment, and we need to move on to our second segment of the presentation of the evening.
That final comment leads right into the question that I have for you. So thank you. I've brought this up at another outreach that you guys did, but I'll bring it up again here. That one of my other concerns with this process is what I see in the materials and in presentations is this look ahead. Growth is coming in the next 20 years. Where is it going in the next 20 years? And I don't see enough pausing to look back and say, oh, so here's what we predicted in 94. Here's what we predicted in 2004. How did that work out as part of this? Because we know that in some places we didn't do a good job with infrastructure, or we know that in some places we are so above and beyond what was forecast for 2024 growth targets, that there are some people, and I'm not advocating pro or anti-growth, but there are people here in the city who say, Ballard, parts of West Seattle are like 100, 200% above target, and they would say, we want zero growth now for the next 20 years because we've already taken everything we said we'd take by 2024. And that's certainly a legitimate case to make, whether people agree one way or the other. So is there a spot in this plan? Is there that section to look at and say, here's what we said what would happen, and how does that now determine what
So there is some information in here, and it looks at, where the jobs and where the housing occurred, and it also looks at some broader demographic trends. There's a lot more detailed kind of census information on our website. The department does publish I think this is what you're referring to, where there's a monitoring report where housing and jobs, so it's showed year by year, so you can see how many new houses and how many new jobs over, again, starting in 1995 and through there's a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice that information. The one thing that is so clear is that there is so much confusion about what what those individual planning estimates mean. A lot of people interpreted them to mean, that's a cap. If we grow more than that, terrible things are gonna happen in our neighborhood. And that was never the intention. So I don't know what the solution is, but that's definitely on our radar screen, and that's something we're gonna probably be.
I wouldn't say
talking
terrible,
about.
but keeping in the
Yeah.
West Seattle context.
Uh-huh.
You know, we have about 3,000 units coming on in the Triangle area, starting about a year or so ago and looking out another year or two. That's a whole lot of people. And I'm not sure that we're prepared to have jobs in West Seattle, so presumably most of those people are looking to leave West Seattle for their jobs. And I'm not sure that we did an adequate job to get infrastructure in place in the Triangle. We all knew when, Hewling and everybody left, we didn't really think that growth was gonna happen so quickly. So there's not a whole lot of infrastructure up there, we're scrambling to get it in. So that's sort of what I'm talking about there is, oh my gosh, we're ahead of where we thought we would be in that area. What do we do to catch up?
And pretty much that's the case in every urban village in Seattle, except maybe one or two. So they've all grew more than we've estimated in just that last 10 years. Again, in 20 years, if we bundle that into a 20-year period, which is what the estimates were really designed to look at, a longer period, you see it kind of flattening out a little bit. So in 10 years from now, we'll know, was it just a spike or was it really something more substantial? We don't know right now. So that's one of the challenges too, because we do know that the real estate is spiky. It's not a constant sort of estimate. And I know you need to move on.
Okay, thanks,
But
Patrice.
we're gonna have a lot more
So-
conversations. We got a whole nother, we still got a year before we actually come up with a plan, so thank you for giving me some extra time tonight.
So with that, we will segue into pedestrian zones, and we'll turn it over to Al.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass around some more paper while we're talking. So I'm Ally Panucci. I'm a planner in the Department of Planning and Development as well. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about a zoning tool we use called it's a pedestrian zone. And the name can be a little confusing, but in this context, it's a zoning designation. A pedestrian zone is used in our neighborhood commercial zone, so areas in the city where we allow sort of a mix of uses, residential and commercial. The areas and sort of gold on the map are the neighborhood commercial zones. And the intent of a pedestrian zone designation is to really promote and protect and encourage a very pedestrian-oriented shopping and service area in a neighborhood commercial zone. So what it does is when we add the pedestrian zone designation, in our neighborhood commercial zones, it adds some additional rules in order to encourage that sort of ideally walkable neighborhood business district. So it adds some rules. One of the main thing is that it adds a requirement at the street level of new development, 80% of the building has to be an active commercial use. So things like neighborhood serving shops and services, community centers, libraries, parks, if it's a park, obviously it's not a building, but sort of uses that encourage activity and provide some services to the neighborhood, real estate offices, insurance offices, that type of thing. So it adds some protection in areas in terms of making sure that as redevelopment occurs, there continues to be some commercial services available in the neighborhood. And then if the development is going to include, other stories, residential or other types of uses can be located above the street level or facing a side street or that type of thing. But it's really trying to preserve that street level environment for uses that provide services to the neighborhood. It also adds some rules about parking, where it's located and how it's accessed. Parking in a neighborhood commercial zone typically can be located to the side of the building, behind or within the building. When you have the pedestrian zone designation, you cannot locate parking in front or to the side. It has to be located behind the building or within the building if you're providing parking. And how parking accessed. It prioritizes access via an alley if there's an adequate alley to provide service, and if not, an alley access from a side street. And if your main street's your only access point, then from the main street it limits it to one curb cut. The idea is to try to limit the number of interactions on the sidewalk with driveways, to limit those pet auto potential conflicts and promote sort of walking in the area. And then in addition, in areas where there is a minimum parking requirement in place, it does provide some parking waivers, so some parking reductions for the non-residential uses in the development at that street level. So I know parking is often a big question, and so typically, parking requirements are set for commercial businesses, usually on a sort of one space per so many square feet of the business. Like one space per 500 square feet, and usually there's some deduction for the first 1,500 square feet of that building of that business. In a pedestrian zone, you get a bigger deduction before the minimum parking requirement goes in. So in most of the neighborhood commercial zones, the first 4,000 to 5,000 square feet of the business is exempt from minimum parking requirements. So we are, to step back for a minute, we used to, over the years, have a requirement for those street level uses in most of our commercial zones, along most of our arterials around the city, and we've sort of scaled that back over the years because we were getting complaints and there were concerns about sort of overbuilding that retail and commercial space environment, having some vacancies in some neighborhoods. So we focused that requirement in our pedestrian zone designation so that you can sort of create nodes around the city. And so when we sort of scaled back that requirement and built in that flexibility and focused it on pedestrian zones, there were 60 areas around the city that were identified as, okay, we're allowing flexibility generally in our commercial zones, but these areas we want to look at and make sure that we want to have that flexibility everywhere, and while also ensuring that neighborhoods around the city continue to have access to some commercial services. So these 60 areas are sort of the study areas we're looking at now, and they're the hatched areas shown on the map that we're looking at right now to determine whether or not we should add a pedestrian zone designation to encourage that sort of walkable neighborhood business district. So we're looking to make recommendations on whether or not it should be a pedestrian zone, and at the same time, we're also looking at the rules that apply in pedestrian zones to say, are there some adjustments that need to be made? We're looking at the mix of uses that are permitted in a pedestrian zone to see if some uses should be added. One of the uses that I'm hearing a lot out in the neighborhoods is allowing more office uses, so allowing things like architects and lawyers and things like that at the street level, and also allowing arts facilities, which are sort of a nonprofit arts organization, and they're currently permitted in the Pike Pine pedestrian zone, but not in other pedestrian zones, so expanding that to be allowed more broadly. We're also looking at potentially requiring overhead weather protection for new development in pedestrian zones, looking at our rules around drive-in businesses. Businesses with a drive-in lane are prohibited in a pedestrian zone. There's been some concerns that if you prohibit it in the pedestrian zone, then that business locates right on the edge of the pedestrian zone. So should we have sort of a walking buffer zone around the edges of the pedestrian zone? Primarily what I've been hearing so far is that that just creates another line that then they locate on, and there are some businesses that have a drive-in sort of format that are needed and wanted in neighborhoods. Like I said, reviewing the required ground level uses, and then looking at establishing a minimum floor area requirement, so minimum size of the building related to the size of the lot. In urban centers, urban villages, and station area overlay districts, there are some rules in place right now that establish some minimum floor area requirements that were adopted on an interim basis last September in response to some concerns about a single-story sort of chain store format that was being proposed in some neighborhoods, and there was some concern that that sort of format of development wasn't meeting the expectations of the neighborhoods in terms of size or layout. So we're looking at whether or not we should make those rules permanent. And also not included on the handout, but we have been talking about looking at our sidewalk requirements, but we're going to take a step back on that, so we have more time to coordinate with the Department of Transportation on how we might implement sort of increased sidewalk width and design standards in our pedestrian zones, and sort of taking a broader looking, thinking about also connections to the pedestrian zone. So that's the project in a nutshell. We're looking at the areas as whether or not to designate the pedestrian zone and looking at whether or not we should be making adjustments. And in terms of timing, we have done some initial analysis, and that's posted on our website, and we're getting feedback on that. We've had a survey going for several months now, and several of you I've seen at several meetings actually, so some of you probably could give this presentation. Getting feedback, and then we're hoping to sort of take in all the feedback after the survey closes at the end of this month, reassess our initial analysis, and then start moving forward with formal recommendations that will get forwarded to the mayor and the council. We're aiming towards the end of summer, early fall for forwarding those final recommendations, and in the interim, those revised recommendations will be published. So that's the speed dating version of pedestrian zones. Do you have questions?
Question, Patrick?
Yeah, so I have a question. So I live near the Delridge and Brandon, the neighborhood zone there. And my big concern is, I think reading over your wish list is great.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the experience I have in my neighborhood is that there is no development unless it's low-income housing. And so you add more requirements to what developers need to do, that basically means the next development will be more low-income housing. So how will DPD encourage positive growth in my community? I mean, this is basically another roadblock saying market rate housing won't come in because they look at other areas of Seattle where it's more appealing and they know they're going to have better rents or condo sale numbers, but in this neighborhood, there's no growth at all. So, it's just another roadblock to that neighborhood being developed, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because it's difficult for us to sort of predict the type of development in terms of if they're going to propose market rate housing or affordable housing in a lot of cases. I've heard similar comments from others in this neighborhood particularly, and so I guess it's a question of balancing. You could not add the pedestrian zone or add any other restrictions and just sort of see what happens, but then it could be that maybe you get market rate housing or more housing, a mix of housing or whatever it is, without any services, without any commercial, and so the idea with this is that whether it's housing or other types of development, you at least ensure some level of services, but I don't have an answer to your question on how to ensure that it's market rate housing.
Well, no, the market rate doesn't actually have anything to do with it. It's just, I doubt, right now there's no possibility for low-income housing in the area, or at least subsidized by the city. But, the fact is how in areas that aren't being developed will there be some encouragement for development in those areas? The whole area, that whole strip is NC 40, I think.
Yeah.
Nothing's being developed there. Nothing has been since it was rezoned, 92,000?
I think, wasn't it
There's basically been
part of the neighborhood planning process.
there's
Would have been in the late 90s.
Yeah, there's basically been, pretty much no growth. There's, the DSC project, the library project with both low-income housing, the condominiums, which was a part of the library.
Well, and those buildings to the north.
Well, it's not
But
part of the
that's
library.
also like 8 years ago, over 8 years ago. There's been no growth in basically 10 years.
What?
Same area, different angle question.
Okay.
What I'm curious about is how come, and in the study, I'd be curious to know not just about the sidewalk areas, but why is that neighborhood commercial zone so large for such a narrow possibility of density? Because like in the little narrow Delridge corridor there, basically 3 blocks worth of houses, and the neighborhood commercial zone is like a quarter of the entire possibility area, that's like possible build area.
Yeah.
So it seems like it was basically like an excuse for developers to build big buildings where there was really no call for it. So it doesn't, and that's kind of maybe an unpopular argument, but it seems like the center is too big for the area on all of the city maps of different,
Neighborhood commercial zone.
for where can be built, you know?
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for the sort of, I mean, the history of the zoning in this particular area, or, I mean, in these areas generally. I mean, they're often sort of follow sort of the pattern of development, or the types of uses that were there over, you know, history, that type of thing. In terms of the pedestrian zone, you know, we are sort of looking at the whole area. It certainly could just be, you know, one of the things would also be helpful is maybe you think there should just be a node that's a pedestrian zone within that neighborhood commercial zone, and then on the edges, on the outer blocks, then there'd be more flexibility, so it could just be residential, or it could be mixed use, or it could be commercial. There wouldn't be that requirement. So that's another way to go, that it could be a narrow sort of focus.
Because like in my situation, I live behind that on 23rd, on the one little narrow street that's zoned single family, abutting NC 40, which is the main, like if it's gonna be NC 40 there, and I am not necessarily in favor of this, shooting myself in the foot, but it seems like the 23rd zone should be multifamily, and there's gonna be a business node there. There needs to be more density to support it.
And 25th too.
Yeah, 25th too, and
Isn't there supposed to be a
I actually like living in a single-family neighborhood personally. Smaller houses I'm fine with, yards and gardens and stuff, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And to me, it seems like that whole area has got to be much more built up to support a sidewalk.
Oh, sure, yeah, I think that's one of the things with the pedestrian zone designation. Sometimes it's used to sort of protect an existing sort of already established business district. In other areas, it's more like a vision for the future. If development happens, when development happens, we're sure that there will be some commercial area preserved, so that if development happens, it's not just residential development. Because while you might like your single-family neighborhood, you might also want a few places to walk to grab a cup of coffee or get help or whatever, go to a library, that type of thing. So it's a tool that's used to sort of protect and sort of encourage or hope, that it establishes that protection for the future if and when development occurs.
And in this utterly, it seems like the best laid plans of neighborhood groups and DPD and folks getting together of what they want something to be, that doesn't seem to be what is happening with the zoning rules and how things are actually being built. So maybe they need to be much more restrictive, so that if there's a dream of how something should be, then maybe the rules should actually be in place to actually make that happen, not some 5-story with this exception, that exception, and that exception, that makes everything way bigger and not really conducive to the environment that was dreamed of, I guess.
Okay. Michael, last question for this section, then we need to move along to our next portion.
Well, I'm going to say I'm really in favor of having a pedestrian zone here in Delridge. For me, the issue is if we're going to have development, I want development that I want the good development. I don't want some of the crappy stuff that we currently have there. I agree with Patrick. We struggle a little bit with whether developers actually want to come here at all. But if they're going to come and build a 3 or 4-story building, I'd much rather it looks like the DESC with the potential for a nice store on the bottom, or it looks like the library with nice open windows on the bottom. And if we had this in place, we wouldn't have things like the 24-hour market that's there, or even a pizza place, which I love the pizza place, but you could walk by and not know that it was a restaurant because there's no windows and So I'm very in favor of this, because at least it helps keep out the things we don't want coming in anymore.
Okay, I lied, one last comment.
Oh, okay. I have a comment, it's not even a question. My only concern is the prohibitions on parking, that a street like Delridge is not a walkable street right now, which I understand this is supposed to address. But not allowing businesses to have parking there is a deal breaker, I would imagine, for any business, because there's very little parking as it is, and if you couldn't park there, they have to go to Patrick's house, right around the corner. And it's all residential, and it's already all backed up, so that is one issue, that I think would be a problem here, is just
Yeah.
having that space.
I do just want to clarify, it doesn't prohibit anyone from providing parking. It reduces how much we tell them they have to provide. So if a business is coming in and thinks they need parking to support their, if they're building a new site, so that, it is,
But we only have street parking, so there is no other place for them to park, so that's prohibited, right?
no,
Oh, okay.
on-street park, it doesn't do anything about on-street
Okay,
parking.
I
It's
apologize.
how much parking would have to be required off-street
I
if
see.
you were building a new site.
Okay.
You require off-street parking now?
In some area, yeah.
It's like, no. You don't have time to.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
I don't know.
okay, thanks, Ally. Okay, so next up is David, and David was here in January, December,
Yeah,
and is back for an encore presentation.
I think it's in the hot seat. And if you like that conversation, I can deliver probably 9 more months of that. Seriously. And my name is David Goldberg. I'm not going to give a lot more new information, but I think a little bit more detailed information than the last time I spoke with you all. And I think only maybe 4 of you or 5 of you were here at the last time I spoke. So, David Goldberg, Senior Planner with the Department of Planning and Development. Thought of all these things, the conversation was coming down. I live in Ballard, where there's, it seems to be the poster child of growth. It's not the fastest growing part of the city, however. And I'm actually working on planning in Ballard right now as well. By way of introduction, my first introduction to Delridge was by Vivian McLean, who drove me around as I began to look at being the project manager for one of the, I think, 2 project managers for the original Delridge, neighborhood plan. So I have some familiarity that goes back quite a ways, and as a result of Vivian's car tour, when I came to buy a house, I bought one up on Pigeon Point, about a block and a half away from Deeds Spalding. So I have some familiarity with the area, but probably not as much, now living in Ballard, not as much as you guys do about the current things. So Delridge is not an urban village, but it is an area that decided it wanted to plant back in the day and was given the resource to do neighborhood planning. But it doesn't have specific growth targets for it. That said, it's an area of the city because of its attributes, who it is as a community, who it wants to be and aspires to be. The city thinks that it's a good idea to come back and take a look at your plan and see what we can do to help move the dial on some of these things that have been longstanding desires of the community. So what I want to talk today is about our thesis, what we think we're planning about, why we think we're here, and our process for where we're thinking about looking, and our process for fully developing our understanding of why we're planning, and then coming to a series of recommendations and strategies that are the outcomes of our planning. If there are questions along the way, I'd be happy to get them, but might as well get through the just overview so everybody has the same piece of information. So the purpose of this, it's a little bit refined from the last time I spoke with you guys, but, and partially in reflection of the discussions that we had here last time. So one of the first objectives is placemaking, looking at the Brandon node, the Andover node, the Orchard, Sylvan Way node. That was a part of the Delridge plan to encourage development in each one of those areas. desire is still there, and like some other communities in the city, development hasn't occurred the way the community wants it to be. So we also want to, as one of the comments here today several of the comments here talked about, look at how that development occurs not in a silo, but in coordination with a conceptual plan for a long-term improvement project for Delridge Way, the northern Delridge Way portion. Delridge community has been fortunate in that it's one of the pilots that the city has funded to look at coordinated transportation and land use planning. Typically, we design roadways after we get some money. And at that point, we have a budget. And then we develop a scope and schedule. And it's very difficult to kind of change the project configuration at that point. So the notion is, if we get together and talk about what the project is before we do our budgeting, we can develop a scope for the transportation project that really fits and tailors the need of the community, and is not driven by the available grant that happens to be present at the time. So the notion is that we don't have a project, we don't have a budget. What we will have is an opportunity to look at the design of the roadway, look at the community and say, how do the two fit together? And then from that, what would a road project look like?
Can I just ask a quick question here? So with that having been said, what coordination are y'all doing with that stuff right this very second?
They're not in the room, so not being facetious.
No, I'm just saying, with you're presenting this plan, so with this plan, what coordination do y'all have with SDOT going on right now as it impacts Delridge Way Southwest from the bridge to Home Depot?
I'm not involved in any current work that they're doing right now. What I am scoped to work with is a team of people who have funding to look at project as a planning project moving forward. So I know there was a recent neighborhood street fund application and some missteps with the way that went. The paving, the asphalt over of some planting strips. I'm now working with people on that kind of current development.
The reason I asked that question is because SDOT has informed the community in the last week that they're getting ready to redesign the northern portion of Delridge Way Southwest with work to commence this summer. And, it once again is disconcerting to the neighborhood that we've started down this path of getting money, in the SDOT budget to look at the whole planning process for Delridge Way Southwest and revisioning it. And then, and then we have the neighborhood plan update, but yet then, another arm of SDOT is moving ahead with no community input on redesigning a piece of the roadway. And so it's like, I mean, it's like, so who do we believe at this point?
So that was a project it's been funded for a while. And my understanding of it is it started as basically a repaving project, and it has turned, and there's been some rechannelization as a result of it, and some bike lanes put in the southern portion, and there's still some work to do in the northern portion. That is a much more limited scope of project than what this will be, is my understanding.
This is totally redesigning an intersection that impacts the entire.
Which intersection is it?
It's where 23rd Avenue comes into Delridge Way Southwest, just north of the entrance ramp onto the West Saddle Bridge.
I thought that was a part of a grant.
Yeah,
To
they got the
widen the
money and
sidewalk?
they're going forward with the project, like you just said, that the.
But the point is that there's the city council appropriated money in this year's budget to totally look at revisioning Delridge Way Southwest from the bridge to Home Depot. And if they're gonna start doing it piecemeal again, then how does that work into what our long-range vision is? That it's like, we went to them and they said, yeah, we agreed that that's what we're gonna do, but yet we still are hit with these
So
other
I'll
projects.
look into that, and chances are, if it's funded, it responds to an immediate issue. And if there was something that needed to be addressed safety-wise or something or other, and money was available before this current planning money became available. I'll take a look at it. There's gonna be a lot of these things, if you pursue each one of these things right now, it'll be hard for me to get through it, but I'm happy to get all of these things and see whether in the course of our discussions we can sort them out and get response to you. So the next thing is looking at actions to improve health outcomes in the community in general. And this is a community that's been very interested in access to healthy food. And I think also access to the ability to what we call active transportation, walking and bicycling, etc. And the foundation of this planning work we see being what does it take to increase the overall health of the community. We know this is a community that has a disparity in terms of health outcomes for its population. It's got high heart disease, high rates of diabetes. And one of the things that we want to do is take a look at what is the relationship between the community environment, the physical aspects, the social aspects, the things that the city and the community can work on that might change the dial on the health outcomes of the community. So that is a core component of the work that we've done. A second piece of that health piece is something that we heard in several forums, and that is looking at drainage in the overall area and how this fits into how people use the area. And it's a combination of issues: drainage, surface water drainage, groundwater, development, sidewalks, etc. that all kind of compound and I think affect how people use their community and people's choice to walk in many instances. So that's something that we're going to be taking a look at. I've met so far, maybe I don't have all the projects, but I look forward to hearing about them. I've met with SBU to talk about the work that they're going on, and there's a couple projects underway, and one of which is a local area drainage improvement that's they're beginning working on. It's a localized flooding project, and that's at Alaska, so the south end of the playfield, really Alaska and Cottage Street Southwest. That area probably, is that an area you know of?
So that's my block, yeah.
Right, okay.
That's where SBU had the truck that kind of fell in a ditch and they couldn't get out without a crane.
And they said, oh, we should have a drainage project here. So, there's a project there. And then the last piece is that as an outcome of the planning project, we want your experience to be so awesome and you're working together with each other to be so awesome that it will increase the capacity of your community to take on projects. This is a community which bootstraps itself. So there's a lot of resources to build on, and we want our work in terms of planning and working with the community to basically augment that. So to do that, we're looking at focusing primarily at issues within this core area that the community identified back in the mid-90s as being the Delridge community. We will engage the population that uses that community from a larger area. For Westwood Highland Park issues, I think that there's still a question of should we do other planning there?
Yes.
And we could change.
Yes, that's not the question.
Right, and we can change. Well, there is a question, and we don't have an answer to that. So, and there's another question: should we continue to plan down towards White Center, etc.? And there's a range of opinions of it. Our approach at this point is to focus on a few key issues and try to be effective about those. We recognize that some people view Delridge as a long community, and the Delridge Neighborhoods is a deliberate choice of wording. I understand that. And our focus is to try to create a focus around a portion of the Delridge communities, around a series of issues, the drainage issues, the issues about the Brandon node, and maybe looking at the Sylvan and Andover node as well, and this core portion of the corridor, which is from Sylvan Way north, to look at the road projects. So those projects are kind of giving us a geographic focus. That is our, as I said, thesis moving forward, and there may be things which come up which pull us further afield. We'll have to look at whether we have the time and resources to take a look at those at that point. That's our thesis, and we'll comment on that for a little bit longer while I talk about the outreach. So I mentioned that we're going to use a healthy framework. Our idea, this is something we developed when we were working in the Rainier Beach neighborhood. that sometimes when we do planning, we look at jobs and housing, and sometimes when we do planning, we look at social planning as well. And with the outcome that we've developed in working in Rainier Beach, we developed a framework that basically starts from a point of what is a healthy community. And we would like this planning process to have outcomes that support the three components. You could choose other components, but we think these are three good organizational components of creating a strong community and organization, creating healthy people and families, and a supportive physical environment. And I won't read through all the bullets on the side, but you can. In order to do that, we're looking at a number of phases of work and public engagement that correspond to those phases. Phase 0 is a word that we use because that's our kind of project initiation rather than, we're not doing true analysis at that point. But that's work we've begun already. We're beginning work with the Department of Neighborhoods, who will be our partners throughout this project, to begin outreach to historically underrepresented communities. Those are primarily communities of color. And then also elderly and renters and children. We're looking at spreading information about this potential scope of the project. In our initial conversations, trying to determine whether our thesis is good, and then completing our background report. The first phase, when we really start rolling up our sleeves, is we'll convene the community and all aspects of it, including historically underrepresented communities, to identify issues, opportunities, and prioritize those. That will be this summer, we hope. Fall will be when we develop our responses. We call those strategies, and that we'll be developing those strategies as what can we, the city, and what can you, the community, do to address those opportunities and issues. And as we move to the winter, we look to develop an action plan that says, what are the initial steps, best as we know them, that both the city and the community can take to move forward on these. And then 5, the last phase, phase 4, is basically producing the final plan. And we begin work on some of our implementation. We are there ourselves right now because we know that we're committed to doing some of the outcomes work for this. But it's likely that as we move on, we will see community partners there and other department partners there in terms of doing the implementation work. Okay, engagement through all of those phases will be multifold. We'll be looking at creating an advisory committee. Our outreach to historically underrepresented communities will help involve those. We'll look for involvement for people who can commit to the planning process, who see the possibility or hope to be able to continue working on implementing these projects moving forward. We'll look at people who have a connection to the area as well as a connection to the issues that we're tackling. And we're looking for people who can work together. So we'll have a formal process where we begin soliciting those, and all of you will receive an invitation to invite. And hopefully through the process, you'll meet with people in the neighborhoods that will be involved with you in the future. I'll stop there. I missed everything, but I'm sure you get the questions. We'll fill in the blanks.
You mentioned the infrastructure issue, drainage, the problem with the I know you've heard about. And in terms of infrastructure, that's become our council's #1 concern. And I'd like to see it in writing on here, just to make sure that it's captured.
Yeah, okay. I will do that.
I think that would make us feel better.
Sure. And then I should, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, do that.
And you sure you want to go now as opposed to the last question? Michael, and then back to.
I'll be honest, I had the same concern that I had last time you were out here, and I've had for a while, which is that frankly, I just don't trust DPD on this.
Can you be specific about that?
Things look and sound good, but I'm seeing a lot less collaboration and a lot more inform and communicate from the city, which is a problem because, as we've brought up before, that's not what this neighborhood asked for. We've made it clear repeatedly that this neighborhood has been working a lot on our own since the last time DPD bothered to pay attention to us. And I'm not seeing, as Kirsten's comment brought up, I'm not seeing captured here what the neighborhood has been working on for the last several years. I'm seeing what the city has now suddenly decided is a priority. In particular, what concerns me is the strong emphasis on access to healthy food, which sounds funny because that is actually a concern of our neighborhood and has been for a while. And that's why I feel like how interesting that it's been a concern of ours for a long time. We've been doing a lot of work on it, and suddenly DPD comes in with their own ideas of what this should look like, and has already been doing a whole lot of work and outreach around this issue without talking to the neighborhood groups at all about it. So I'm just being honest that there's a bit of a level of distrust around what DPD's intentions are in doing this and how willing you are to really get into the neighborhood and collaborate.
Very fun. And so you're right, we haven't had a conversation yet. I'm just here giving you my thesis. And I have a benefit of some knowledge, maybe that's dangerous knowledge. Our attempt here is to reflect the work that the community has done to date. So we're spending a fair bit of time actually working with internally kind of understanding what has the city done so far to help or not help on the access of health, on the issue of healthy food and access. It's all going to be a collaboration. It's not actually, that's one area where it's a huge opportunity for us to figure out how we can help rather than what can we do.
Sure. And we did a whole lot of work, for example, to work on bringing a co-op grocery into this neighborhood, which has been a struggle and is continuing to be a struggle. A lot of that work came about because DPD basically told us, not a whole lot we can do for you, you might want to work on this on your own, so we did. And now all of a sudden, DPD is very interested. Some conversations were happening at the city level, and by a fluke, luckily somebody in the community found out what was going on. Otherwise, the folks at the table didn't even know we were working on a co-op grocery here in the neighborhood. And I know that that the city is having conversations with Whole Foods. And that's a concern of mine, that I don't want anything to do with Whole Foods coming into our neighborhood. With all the work that we've done. And those are the kinds of things that happen. I'm very worried about what the city's intentions are in the neighborhood.
Let's have lunch. Because that's news to me. I don't know everything that goes on in the city. I know a fair bit, but I don't know everything that goes on in the city. And I can tell you that I'll work the project as a project manager, try to move the project forward. And sometimes that will feel as if I'm talking to you, talking to you. But the way that the process will go will be a collaboration. I'm not saying that we're here now to solve the problems. I'm saying we're here to work with you to kind of identify what is it that the city can do. We haven't been present, but we're now making a decision to be here, to be present in a way. And that we're going to be here for 9 months. We're going to have an involvement after that. So it's a chance for us to figure out what the steps are we take from this point. And I think you'll feel that there's a lot of conversation, a lot of collaboration at the end of it.
Aaron?
I was open up if you have any questions about drainage on 23rd, and I just walk you around. Because the drainage projects that have been talked about have all been nixed as way too expensive. So it's better to make nice neighborhoods nicer than bad neighborhoods up to like 1950s standards. And the drainage projects that have been done on my little street has been me with a shovel keeping the storm drains and focusing water into the storm drains rather than into people's driveways in my basement.
And that is in many part of your responsibility as a homeowner.
For sure.
So so here's what I want to do about this. So I've had a conversation with both the DPD folks who regulate drainage. So we're the permitters, and SPU deals with some drainage, not all drainage. And so what I want to do, and what I've started to do, is collect locations. Where are some of these issues? And then go to SPU and DPD and say, give me the background on this. Where does your department's work begin and end, and where does my department's work begin and end on this? And where are the gaps are? Some of the things So there's a piece of education that goes on. Having specific information helps us to identify exactly the causes for this. So there's a piece of education that I want to bring forward. The second piece is to look for opportunities to raise awareness to DPD and to SPU. Did we miss something? Are we following our rules and still ending up with a problem? Are we, and then sometimes, and I've seen this work in the Bitter Lake and Broadview neighborhood, sometimes as a result of raising the awareness, like calling 911, the equivalent of calling 911 on drainage, and reporting all the drainage issues, SPU becomes aware of a project that they need to do. So there are opportunities to do the work. I'm not going to say we're going to come in and bring you up to an area, because this is a neighborhood that for a number of reasons was developed without sidewalks, and so playing catch up with that, our primary means to doing that is either the general fund or the ratepayers.
Yeah. And to be honest, I'm well aware of the fact, basically, that everything on my side of 23rd, behind Delridge, every single building in that is way past end of life, including mine. So, I'm in the long-term visioning process, like thinking about the little portion that I live in. The long term would be that I will likely leave because it won't become what I like to live in. But looking at the scope of the neighborhood, it's really being used incorrectly for what everybody keeps talking about. More walkable sidewalks, more local businesses, more density. It doesn't make any sense for it to be like it is. So I would say, shooting myself firmly in the foot, my little section is really just zoned incorrectly.
So where are you?
Like between Ramsey and Finley, or even down to,
It's the west side of 23rd.
yeah, west side 23rd.
Okay. And that would be some of the things we take a look at, and then taking a look at, so for example, we used to require townhouses under a certain number of units to put in sidewalks. The idea was, not putting a roadblock in front of a small development. It's really hard for a single family, small number of projects to put in sidewalks.
But who's done it?
Because they would actually essentially have to design a whole street.
So I know we still have a number of questions, but we still have another presenter on the schedule, and she's here. So let's do that presentation. I'm sure David will be more than happy to stick around, and folks can ask questions, and we'll come back to this. But let's move along to.
I'm okay to give it 5 more minutes for questions.
Well, let's let you do your presentation.
Someone ask my question. Okay.
Well, there's like 4 people